Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. Slightly dry subject to start with, I'm afraid, for the day, but I will endeavour to keep you awake through the session. We're going to be looking at the Sustainable Use Directive and also specifically how it affects you guys. Because any legislation, as you know, tends to cover quite a wide area. So what I've basically done is just pick out some key points that are relevant to you guys and the things that you need to be taking account of. And there, I'll also have a little look about Brexit in terms of what impact that could have on the sector that we're all involved in. So, what is the Sustainable Use Directive? Well, basically it is what we call an overriding piece of legislation. So, what tends to happen with legislation is you get lots of little bits of legislation which can often contradict each other. And this bit of legislation basically overrides and pulls a lot of different pieces together. So at least you can actually see what you need to do, how you need to do it, and how you can keep legal. Because obviously with pesticides, it's an emotive subject. It unfortunately has become very much a political subject. And we would really love it if actually we could just talk about science rather than about politics. But that isn't the way that it is. So it does mean that there's a lot of pressure on the industry to actually make sure that it lives up to the expectations of government. And there's a number of things that we'll go through in here where I believe the industry needs to up its game and actually prove to people that we are looking at a sustainable approach to using the products that we want to use. So the legislation actually came in place in 2012, so it's actually been around quite a long time. Like an awful lot of legislation, it has a work-in period on a number of aspects. So we'll cover a number of those. The issue we now got is actually all of the work-in periods have passed. So actually, all of the things within the Sustainable Use Directive we should be doing. And unfortunately, we're not doing all of them. So some of these might be a bit of a reminder of the things that we need to be doing. Like any piece of legislation, it has an objective. This is a European piece of legislation that has now been included within UK law. For any of you who are aware, basically EU law at the moment oversees anything to do with any local law. What happens is that directives and various bits of legislation are sent out from Europe and they are then incorporated into local legislation. And this one is now incorporated, enacted, and should be being followed. So it is looking to try and get achievable, sustainable use of pesticides, reducing the risk to and the impact of pesticide use for human health, which has to be a good thing, for the environment, which has to be a good thing, and also promoting the use of IPM, integrated pest management, is absolutely a huge part of what this is all about. Because the days of actually having magic in a bottle, as much as it would be nice, I'm afraid they're very much numbered. We have lost a lot of products. We will lose more products going forward, but that's a subject for a completely different seminar rather than the actual legislative element that we want to talk about today. The other interesting aspect, and this is where some of the politics comes in, is that actually written into the Act, it is actually a requirement that we look at techniques that are non-chemical, and that's where the integrated part comes in. So, in effect, the whole industry has now been challenged, whether it be amenity or agriculture, with actually looking at non-chemical alternatives to pesticides. So that is something that we all have to bear in mind and take a note of. What I'll have to do now is just go through a few bits of legislation or topics that are actually relevant. So the Sustainable Use Directive actually came out of a 10-year process of negotiation, if you want to call it that, within Europe, around the thematic strategy for PPP is plant protection products. Because obviously we're talking about agriculture as well as we are talking about amenity. And pesticides are referred to as PPPs. So if ever you see that, that's what that means. So in order to sell a pesticide, the first thing you have to do is actually have the pesticide on the authorization regulations. So the active substance has to be on those regulations. And we'll come back to that in a minute because actually it's very relevant for looking towards the future. The next part is there are all sorts of other pieces of legislation that actually mention pesticides within them. One very key one is the Water Framework Directive, where basically a number of years ago an arbitrary level was set for pesticides in water. 0.1 part per billion is the level that has been set, and basically that means if any single pesticide exceeds 0.1 part per billion, then actually you are exceeding the Water Framework Directive and you have to do remedial measures to reduce it. How many people know what 0.1 part per billion looks like? Yeah? You're not far off, yeah? Basically, if you take a pea or an aspirin, chuck it into an Olympic-sized swimming pool, that actually will now exceed the Water Framework Directive for actually aspirin, salicylic acid, which is what aspirin is, when you put it into water. It is a minuscule amount. The reason it was set at that level was actually at the time that was very close to the most accurate level of detection. Things have moved on a bit now, and certainly with a number of products, we can actually now pick up a factor of 1 million greater than that. So one of the other problems we have with pesticides is Greenpeace will say we found pesticides in water at at a nanogram. So that is 1,000-fold less than the level. But the problem is they found it. Well, you will do, because analytical techniques now are so sensitive, we will be able to find things. Another issue, obviously, was glyphosate, that the Euro MPs decided, well, not they didn't decide, but they were asked to have blood tests, and they found glyphosate. And that's no surprise. Glyphosate has been used for 25 years. It's used on virtually every food crop that we consume. The issue is whether you find it is one thing, but just because you found it, it doesn't mean it's a problem. And unfortunately, that's where politics has got involved into it, because if you find it, oh, that's a disaster, and it's a real problem. So we are not fighting a losing battle, because I don't think we're going to lose it, but we are fighting a very difficult PR battle in terms of it. And all NGOs like Greenpeace are incredibly good at actually raising the profile of a single issue. And they are very, very professional at it. And unfortunately, we are very fragmented as an industry and not very good at it either, because we like to actually sort of keep quiet and hope it will go away. Well, unfortunately, we've got to get on the front foot going forwards. So the other part within there is obviously pesticide residues. That's particularly relevant for edible crops, and obviously every pesticide has what they call an MRL, and that's the level at which it mustn't be exceeded within a foodstuff. So for us, it's not really particularly relevant. But the water framework bit is, because I guess most of you, if you're on golf courses, have probably got a stream, a river, or something running through the course. Then we move into the Sustainable Use Directive, and this is really looking at the use area. So this is the sort of the important bit, and that's the bit we're going to concentrate on now, is when it comes to actually using a product, what's the legislation that we have to work under? Just to keep things simple, there are a few other parts in there, because obviously any time legislation is introduced, basically the government want to understand what is the impact of doing that. So you introduce a piece of legislation, you actually need to have data from your start point to your end point to what effect has it had. And that's done by the statistical regulations, where government has to now collect information about use of amenity products. In agriculture, it's dead easy. I can access market research for agriculture, where I know exactly what product's been applied, the amount it's been applied, when it's been applied, what else has been applied with it, because it is a much bigger crop that actually people pay for the market research. And it's incredibly accurate. In amenity, we don't actually have really a clue about how much product is being used. And they are trying to actually get that information much more accurate. So you may well be asked to complete a survey, and certainly I guess Bigger will be very definitely involved in that, to actually try and ascertain product usage within different areas. Residues will be monitored and reported on. It's a name and shame type thing, because certainly that's the way things are going. So in other words, if a product is bought from Sainsbury's, they find a residue, actually Sainsbury's are named as the bad boys. It's probably nothing to do with them. It's their supplier who it is. But that's how those pieces of legislation work. And water monitoring, that's an ongoing process. As we know, drinking water, river water is monitored the whole time and reported, and that's all in the public domain. So you will see a lot of products are being found in water. But actually the risk of that is very low. So moving on a little bit, what then happens is all of that lot is put together, and each government has to create a national action plan. We're not going to go into that today, but there are one or two key bits within there that need to be talked about. If you really want to read it, just Google it, and you can download the whole document, and you will see there are some paragraphs in there that are relating to the amenity sector. So that's the background. So the key bit now is looking at two parts of that legislation, the Sustainable Use Directive and the authorisation regulations. The authorisation regulations are no different to what happens in the medical side. If you want to bring a drug into the market, it has to get onto a list of acceptable active ingredients. Within agricultural products or pesticides, that's called Annex 1. So once a product, i.e. the active, has had enough work done on it, and it takes about 10 years from discovery to actually getting an Annex 1 registration. So you're looking at toxicology, ecotox, environmental impact, potential MRL levels, because obviously related to the risk or the danger that a product has. So all of that is put together, and that is assessed across the whole of Europe by a regulatory authority. So a product gets onto Annex 1. It can then actually be used by each of the nations within formulated products. You then move on to the next bit, which is actually taking the real products that you and I use. So this is the formulated product, and you look at the real product that you're going to use. So that's the active substance, because that's been cleared on Annex 1. But you then have to look at the whole formulation, because most pesticides, or active ingredients, if you apply them to your target pest, they often won't do anything. It's not until you formulate them that they will actually achieve the results that you're looking for. Because a lot of these products will tend to want to stay within a waxy area, and we actually want to get them through a waxy area in order to achieve the results we're looking for. So there is a big element of the formulation to make these products work. And that is what the local, or each country looks at within EU. So that's a national process. What that does mean is that whilst we supposedly have a pan-European pesticides policy, if you look across to France, Belgium, other countries within the EU, actually the products they have available are all different. And they're all different ratios, they've got different active ingredients in them. That is because it is down to local interpretation as to how you implement allowing a product to be sold. So within that, you're looking at the crop areas. So each crop has a definition. Most of the crops that you guys look after are actually amenity grassland, which is the roughs, and then you're looking at managed amenity turf, which is basically the intensively managed grass. Believe it or not, that crop is completely different to the grass that a cow eats, as far as the registration authorities are concerned. In the past, you used to be able to actually put grass on a label, and then you could add amenity grassland and managed amenity turf. Now you have to actually provide all the data under a completely different model for use within the amenity sector. And that adds a big cost to actually bringing a product in. So the other part that is done at Annex 2 and Annex 3 is the label that actually, of course, you all read in great deal of depth and all understand in terms of how to use the product. The label is also created at this point. In the UK, we have two types of labels. We have professional products, which we'll go on to in a minute in terms of who's allowed to apply those, and amateur products. And the label definitions are quite different within those two sectors. Amateur, basically anybody can use. And the way that they're managing amateur products is the pack size is being reduced dramatically. You've probably noticed it, that if you go into your B&Qs or your garden centres, a lot of the products are either ready formulated or ready diluted, ready to use, or they're in tiny little packs. So that's one way they can manage that sector. We're obviously most interested in the professional sector, and that's the one that we're going to talk about and develop a bit further. It's also, I think, a relevant point now to bring in Brexit, because what we were talking about in the previous slide is European legislation, and it's completely interwoven into UK legislation. And it's not just pesticides, it's the whole gambit. The complexity of what we've got to do to exit EU is absolutely massive when you actually go to the detail of it. But let's talk about pesticides, because that's the bit we're interested in. Certainly, this is a personal view, by the way, because actually at the moment, nothing is coming out of government. Obviously, a certain lady yesterday said, we're going for it and we're going to do it. The only concern is that actually the civil servants haven't been given an awful lot of information about what to do. We obviously liaise very closely with CRD, who are responsible for legislations, and they're pulling their hair out because they actually want a brief and guidance in terms of what they can do. So I'm coming up with a few ideas. Obviously the industry is lobbying as well. But to me, the biggest issue is actually the cost of running a registration scheme just for the UK is going to be absolutely horrendous. And I don't think it's actually going to happen, because if you're doing the whole active substance bit, that requires a huge amount of information, a huge amount of resource, and what actually benefit do you get from doing it yourself? So, I think we will come up with what I would call a hybrid system. The other aspect is obviously with international trade rules. Remember, pesticides, yes, the amenity sector is important for you guys, but it is a tiny, tiny little bit of the total market. If you actually look at all the international trade rules for pesticides, at the moment, the EU standard is accepted. So if you grow tomatoes, wheat, you're allowed to export it to other countries, because they accept the process that you're growing that crop under. So whatever we do, we have to have a process that is accepted internationally, because otherwise UK agriculture will not be able to export, and it wants to. The other option is perhaps what happens in somewhere like South Africa, and obviously in other parts of Africa, is what growers have to do is they know what crop they're growing, they know what market they're growing it for, and they grow the crop to the protocol that is accepted within that country. So if ever you go and see some of these vegetable producers or whatever, actually they can say, well, that's the Indian crop, that's the Russian crop, that's the UK, Europe crop, because they actually grow them under completely different protocols, because the rules are different for different countries. That is a nightmare to manage, because you can imagine with something, particularly commodity products, you've got no idea where that product's going to go. The wheat that you're growing could end up going to France, could end up going to Germany, which is not a problem, but it could also actually go to Egypt or to other countries as well. So you've got to include the international trade rules within the process. The other issue is certainly within Europe, the use of pesticides in public spaces, as I've already said, has become a complete political football. So you may have read that France bans pesticides in public spaces. Yes, it has. France is brilliant at creating legislation, but what they're also very clever at is creating exceptions to that legislation. So they're very happy to create their own legislation. They very rarely follow anybody else's, because we want to do it ourselves. So what they've basically now said is that from this year, full stop. Pesticides are not allowed to be applied in public open spaces. Well, a golf course, you could say, is a public open space. And thankfully, for the guys in France, there are a few exceptions. They've said railways are exempt from this, roadways are exempt, airports are exempt, canals are exempt, sports grounds, golf courses, arenas, and for some reason cemeteries. I don't know why, but cemeteries are exempt as well. So it is all about politics, because with an election coming up, the party in power wants to be seen as green, and they want to get back into power. So that is basically why they've done that. And the same situation is happening in Germany, because the German elections are coming up this year. And if you want my view, the whole reason that glyphosate had a problem was because of the elections coming up. It was about, well, it's better to say nothing than it is to actually be seen to be positive or negative. So basically, France and Germany didn't bother to vote on the glyphosate vote. And because in Europe, you have to get a percentage of the European population to get a majority through, once you take France and Germany out, you can have a bit of a battle. So 21 countries voted for within the glyphosate debate. One country voted against. A really big economic powerhouse, Malta, decided that it wanted to ban glyphosate. And the other countries voted for, and then there were a whole heap of abstentions. So it meant the whole thing ground to a halt. I mean, we genuinely thought that that would just go through without any problem. It's been a real shock to the industry that the antis were able to time their campaign so brilliantly that it went from an almost certainty that it was going to happen to actually nobody could make a decision, and it took an exceptional decision just to actually give an extension for a year. And that could apply to us as well, and it does apply to us because insecticides fall into the same bracket as far as concerns. Private gardens, it's been out for a long time. Basically, they've said they don't want any pesticides used in private gardens from 2019, and they've brought that forward. So, you know, if we are involved in Europe, that's the sort of things you have to contend with. But I suppose the good part to me is that with Brexit, our registration authorities are very, very science-based. They actually understand the industries that we're involved in, and they want to make their decisions on the basis of science. And actually, DEFRA and the political people who they report to are actually very, very pragmatic in terms of how pesticides should be used, and they also understand the value of them to that. Because, you know, some things, if we lose them, the cost to the industry, whichever it is going to be absolutely massive. And again, sorry to go back to glyphosate, but you know, if you actually start modelling the costs to all of us, because we're going to have to pay for keeping the streets clean and all the rest of it, you're talking of 10 to 30 times the cost to actually keep the streets in the way that we used to. People don't really appreciate how good a job that product has done over the years. And also how safe it is, because the alternatives are all less safe. But they're not politically there at the moment because they're not being used in any volume, because they're too expensive and they're not very good. Other than that, it's simple. So, post-Brexit, where do we think we're going to get? Well, I think what the UK will do is we will do a Norway. You've probably heard it before. Basically, Norway pays into Annex 1. So it accepts the fact that if a product is cleared, what's the point of spending all our own money to do exactly the same stuff and duplicate it? So I think we will sign up to something very similar to Annex 1. And then we will also sign up, because we're already doing Annex 2 and 3 ourselves anyway, it does mean, actually, I see that as quite a positive aspect, because we will have more flexibility to what we can do within Annex 2 and Annex 3. So people are saying, well, oh, we'll get chlorpyrifos back. Forget it. You won't. That went because it is seriously dangerous. If you could see the data, and it's publicly available, you wouldn't want to be using chlorpyrifos. But imidacloprid, in terms of merit or something like that, the argument is different, because if you use those products in the right way, actually you can use them as a management tool. So that's where we would stand a better chance to say for the industry, we need to have this product, we need that product available. So what we also need to do is we actually need to now start really building industry support in all the sectors. Obviously within golf, there are organisations who can look at it, and the golf industry is, what do they say, 10 billion value to the economy. So people higher up the chain need to actually understand that actually you guys won't have the tools available to you that you've been used to having. And particularly when it comes to something like worm control, you would say, well, why can't we keep something to control worms? Well, the problem is there is only one crop where worms are a problem, and that is managed amenity turf, or maybe a little bit of amenity grassland. Everywhere else, worms actually are fantastic. They are a beneficial insect. So if I was a Bayer and you're developing a product, what you do is you do it all on computer nowadays, and you say, right, we've designed this product, what effect is that going to have on various things? If that product has any effects on worms, the delete button goes on, because you are never going to generate a product that has effect on worms. Because for agriculture and for the big crops, worms are a key beneficial species. So we actually have to look at different ways to do that. And again, I'm not going to talk about that now, but there will, I'm sure, be other seminars talking about it. And a number of companies are doing a lot of work looking at legal means to actually manage worm populations, because that's what we're going to have to do. So the industry needs to look at the science. We want to actually encourage a science-based approach, and certainly it's something that the golf sector is certainly, Jim and the gang at Bigger are actually looking to work with a number of people to try and actually allow us to keep tools that we need going forward. So in order to do that, what we actually need to do is to differentiate the crops. Because at the moment, if you look at managed amenity turf, that can cross over and be interpreted as lawn. So if a professional person is treating a product, he is allowed to use managed amenity turf products on a lawn. The problem there is that the legislation that we're looking at for exposure of the product has said, right, the worst case is lawns, so actually, if you want to get a product on, it has to pass all the models for exposure on a lawn. And the way they do that is the model looks at an infant rolling in a lawn for 12 hours, one day after treatment. Well, I'm not sure too many of you are going to be too chuffed to have some lovely little baby wandering around and rolling around on your greens for 12 hours. So because that's the worst case scenario, we actually need to separate lawns out. So we need to make greens and maybe tees and maybe even fairways as a specific crop. And that actually has been done because there are products that only have a clearance for tees and greens. So it then means that actually you can have a model that is more relevant to what you're doing. And that is critically important going forward, because safety is absolutely adamant, and you do have to follow the models there, and you do then have to do it scientifically. But the model will always take the worst case scenario. So we need to be looking at actually recreating the crop hierarchy, which is what it's called, to actually help us keep toys in the toy box. And that's the reason why. I mean, what we all want is to freedom to operate, but we need to be operating in a safe and reliable manner. The other thing that, again, I think the industry needs to actually improve on is certainly a key thing within legislating products, is if you can see that a product is being stewarded, in other words, all the people using it have the relevant training, they know what they're doing, and they only use the right products in the right situation, you stand a much better chance of getting things through. So a number of new products coming through will actually have within the label a stewardship requirement, whereby people need to be trained before they're allowed to use the product. And to me, that's got to be a good thing. And obviously the other thing is that any use then has to be auditable. So we actually will need to keep records and actually volunteer to provide that information back to the legislative authorities. The other thing is that the authorities are well aware of this, and CRD now has what they call sector champions. And these guys have actually been challenged with supporting minor sectors. And obviously golf is regarded as a minor sector. But so it's people like herb growers, very small crops, because the cost of actually developing these products and getting label recommendations is absolutely huge. And this is a way of actually supporting some of the more minor sectors. So moving back to the Sustainable Use Directive, again, if you want to read it, download it. It's about a 32-page document. But what I've really done now is just extract 4 or 5 things I really think you guys need to be doing. So, must-dos, need-to-dos, good-to-dos, and we'll move on to those. So one of the must-to-dos, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is that for an operator to use a professional product, he must be suitably qualified. So that, I think, is straightforward, and I believe most people are doing that. But you do need to make sure you are following it through, because the teeth in the legislation comes when you have a problem. So if you do have a problem, you create a wildlife incident, for instance, you go and kill hedgehogs, or you have fish that are dying on a golf course, that's when you need to make sure that. But it's much better to be proactive, so make sure you've actually got your records, and you'll see that this is a common theme: keep records, keep information, even if it's just a note in your diary. As far as a court is concerned, or a tribunal, that actually is a very, very valuable piece of evidence, because it's unlikely to have been forged, because actually if you look at a diary and it's all in sequence, it is quite difficult to buck the system, if you want to call it that. So just by keeping things in a diary note or a day book, it's actually a very, very valuable way of protecting yourself as well. So they do have to have suitable qualifications. What it says is anyone wishing to use professional pesticides must evidence training and hold the appropriate certificates, unless under training and under direct supervision. That bit about training and direct supervision is a time-limited one. It hasn't been tested yet, but I would say 6 to 9 months is the maximum that you ought to be looking at for having somebody who's using products, but they need to get their training done in that sort of time period. There is a list being issued, and again, if you Google that, you can get a list of all of the suitable qualifications that you're allowed. There's no point going through that today, but the main one is PA1, PA2, PA6, but there are variants within that. And that's a list of accepted certificates that are allowable. So what's happening within the legislation? For the first time, the legislation actually includes the fact that if somebody is found to have offended, i.e. not done something they should have done, then they can lose their certificate. So if you're a sprayman, obviously that's pretty significant, because you're no longer able to do your job. So that's the only real teeth in it. There isn't actually a massive fine, because a lot of these offences, actually the fine element is a very small part of the way that things are managed. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, there used to be a grandfather clause. There isn't a lot of point talking about it now because it doesn't exist, and certainly anybody who claimed grandfather rights after November a couple of years ago, that no longer applies. So you have to get an upgraded certificate. The other thing that is very, very clear in here is that an awful lot of the responsibility has gone on to the operator. And again, this is where, as managers or operators, people need to actually look after themselves. Because if an operator is asked by a manager to do something that he doesn't regard as being legal, he is perfectly entitled under employment law to say, sorry, Gov, I'm not doing that because. If you then instruct him to do it, you are then responsible for that. And if your boss has instructed you to do it, then obviously it goes up the line. I mean, ultimately, it will end up with whoever is chief executive or managing director of whoever it is you're working for. But the operator responsibility is actually quite high. It is the operator's responsibility to use the correct product in the correct situation. So if you're using an agricultural product on a golf situation, you know full well you shouldn't be. And actually, that's the operator can say, sorry, Gov, that is an agricultural product, I'm not going to use it. Because he can lose his license if something could come through. So that is the teeth. And the worry in the UK is we all are a little bit laissez-faire about these type of things. Yes, it might be cheaper, but if you look in the States, the pricing differential between agricultural products and amenity products is very similar. But you will not get any superintendent ever even thinking about using an agricultural product on a golf course. Because they know if they do, they will get their arses sued off. And it will be incredibly difficult for them, and they'll lose a job. So there is a bit of a moral area within that one that we all need to take into account. So the operator's got an awful lot of responsibility around when he decides to do, including making sure it's done in the right weather. I know there's always pressures, but if one of the guys does come back and say, look, sorry, I think it's too windy, you actually then need to go out and check that it's right, and you ought to then make a note on your spray records that you've had the discussion and you've made a decision that, yes, it's okay to go, and off you go. So really covered that part in there. The other key bit that is relation to you guys is that the purchase of professional products is one area that was mentioned in the legislation. So what it says, everyone who purchases any professional product must ensure that the intended end user holds a certificate of competence. So what that basically means is anybody can buy professional products, but they are taking on the legal responsibility to ensure that that is used by somebody who has a certificate. If you didn't have that, and people say, well, why is it written like that? Well, you can imagine that actually places like councils, big facilitation companies, even big golf courses, if only the guy who holds a certificate could order the product, things would just grind to a halt. Your guys probably haven't even got the responsibility, it's not allowed for them to order products, whereas maybe the secretary is the one who orders the product. But she needs to understand that she is actually the person who has taken responsibility. So if that is then found to be used by a non-professional, somebody who has not got a suitable certificate, she ends up in court. She's probably not going to be too chuffed about that. So that is the way that law works. So the supplier does have responsibility. People say, well, surely it's the supplier's responsibility. You're selling the product. You must ensure it is. Well, how do you do that? How do we know who's got certificates? In agriculture, it's a lot easier because you tend to have fewer operators and most of the business is done on accounts. So actually, within agriculture, we do actually collect the fact that people have qualified operators. In amenity, it's impossible to do. There's about 60,000 people that apply professional products. So it's not a practical thing to do. But the supplier is responsible to be able to provide suitable advice on the use, safety, etc. of the product. And they should have available somebody who is basis qualified to do that. They don't need to be physically there, they should be available on the phone. So that is a requirement under this piece of legislation. So if the product isn't applied by a suitable operator, then the legal process takes over, and initially the person who bought it takes responsibility, which again, is something that businesses need to be conscious of. If the spray operator applies the product incorrectly, then obviously that isn't the fault of the person who's bought it. So it then drops back to the previous slide of the operator is responsible for that. Next one, spray equipment testing. Certainly it's something that is in there. The date by which you had to have your equipment tested has gone. So what does it mean? It says all mechanical spray equipment except knapsacks and handheld sprayers, must hold a suitable certificate by the 26th of November. The simple one on that, and it isn't dead simple, but basically, if you've bought a machine within the last 5 years, it will have been certificated. And it should have the little NTSC roundel stuck on it somewhere. If that machine is now more than 5 years old, you now have to get it tested. So that's the new machines covered. The definition of a machine is anything that the operator rides. Okay? So whether that be a quad bike or a self-propelled sprayer or a tractor-mounted sprayer. So the operator is riding the spraying equipment. Machines purchased between that period is the one that I've already gone. So a number of machines will now be coming past their 5th anniversary, so you now need to book those in and get them tested. All machines, again, it's not quite as simple as this, but it's easier to take the easy one. They must be tested every 5 years. So if you've had an older machine, you've now had it tested, which of course you will have done because the date has now passed. You now need to book that in for a 5-year test. And the authority that has been given, or the people who have been given responsibility for all that, is the AEA. If you Google NSTS, you can find where your local examiners are, or you might want to speak to your supplier, because a number of suppliers are offering that service to join up the operator or the company and somebody who can do the testing. And that's one where, unfortunately, I've seen some of the data. You haven't got many sprayers out there, boys, because the number of sprayers that have been tested is a very small percentage of the number of sprayers that I know are out there. So you do need to check that. Why do you need to check it? If you have a problem and for whatever reason, I don't know, you're driving along a track, pipe bursts, and you then have to get somebody in to sort it out, then you will actually be up for having to, to do the job properly. The other thing is that if you have an insurance claim, the first thing that a loss adjuster is going to do is they're going to come in and they're going to check your records. And I know already that's on their checklist. What they're looking for is, are the operators qualified? Are the spray machines tested? If they're not tested, sorry guys, your insurance is now null and void. You're on your own. And that is the real teeth within these bits of it. Because the insurance companies, of course, they're lovely companies, aren't they? You know, they all want to keep you on board and all the rest of it. If they can find a way of avoiding payment, they will. So that's the risk to you. Storage of pesticides hasn't really changed much. The only thing that has happened is that this word, reasonable precaution, has come in place. It used to be quite easy. In the old code of practice, it was if you had more than 200 kilos or 200 litres of product, you needed to actually ensure that it was stored correctly and that somebody had a suitable certificate who could look after the stuff in the store. Unfortunately, now that has been replaced with reasonable precaution. Reasonable precaution is quite a good word in some cases, but it's actually quite a dangerous word in others. Because again, it comes back to keeping records. Actually, if I was you, I would actually make sure that one, obviously you've got the relevant equipment stored in the right place, but it would be well worthwhile having a nominated storekeeper because it doesn't take long, it's not a big expense, and actually if you avoid one mistake, you've paid for all of that. So it's probably better to get somebody as a nominated storekeeper, either within the organisation or within your own business. So that is a key area. The other thing is if you're taking product out and about, and this doesn't apply just to pesticides, but applies to fuel as well, you should never leave a can other than in a sealed, locked container. And fuel is the same, strictly speaking. So you do probably want to have a chem safe that you can take around if you go off-site. Obviously, if you're coming back to the shed, to the store, then it's not a problem. The integrated approach now is the final part that we're going to cover here. So what is about integrated approach? Well, to me, interestingly, reasonable precaution is actually quite a good element of integrated approach. Because what an integrated approach is about is looking for the most appropriate method to do anything. It's actually choosing the right product and the right way to do things. It's about minimizing risk. It's about minimizing the amount of pesticide. Well, you all want to do that because you don't want to spend extra money anyway. So it's not a problem as far as I'm concerned. Appropriate degree of control is also relevant because it may well be that actually the odd few weeds in the rough and the stuff isn't a problem. So actually write that down. You know, we've decided that we're happy to work with 2%, 3% of infestation. You're now actually doing integrated control because you've thought about the process, you've actually looked at all the options, and it might well be you decide to go out with a spot sprayer rather than with the boom. And actually you are ticking an awful lot of those boxes by doing that because you're using less product. You're actually only treating the areas that need to be treated. So you are now, well done, doing integrated management and integrated control. Key area, you've got to make sure that whatever you're spraying is what you want to be spraying and you're not spraying next door, and obviously the weather and all the rest of it is a key part of that. So the integrated approach is, to me, is actually about keeping records, getting things managed, thinking about what you're going to be doing. And what I think I'm going to do now, because I'm a devil, I've overrun a little bit, I'm going to skip to the summary and we can then take some questions. The other thing with any pesticide, timing is absolutely critical. We get a lot of people saying, well, look, I've got ragwort, it's lovely in yellow, what do I do? Well, actually, there's an easy answer, because you're now carrying out integrated management. You go out there with rubber gloves and you pull it up. You've now got hazardous waste, by the way, so actually you need to make sure you dispose of that correctly, because obviously it's potentially toxic. Even at this stage, once the plant is actually growing up, most pesticides will only work at a particular life stage of a plant. Once a plant goes from vegetative to reproductive, they're much more difficult to control. So actually, ragwort at that size, a lot of people would have tried to spray it. What happens? Goes all twiggly wiggly and the flowers still come out. So the best approach there is the organic approach and dig it up or pull it up. And that's the size when you want to be catching ragwort. So it's understanding all of these aspects that, to me, is really important. So running through, same applies with fungicides. One thing that we're going to be seeing a lot more is that going forwards, we will be looking at how can we actually protect ourselves. Well, one thing I would say, all of you ought to do an annual check on your sprayer. You don't actually have to physically test it, but at least say, I have checked the sprayer, I've gone round, I've checked the pipes, I've done the rest of it. And again, there's a little checklist there, and do exactly the same with your knapsacks, because your knapsack is probably the thing that is most likely to cause a problem. So it doesn't take 10 minutes to do it. Once you've got a record, you're covered. You're protecting yourself. And the other aspect is certainly, I think in amenity, we will see a lot more of this, because bystander exposure is becoming a much bigger issue. So actually we're looking, and there's some nice, interesting develops on actually shrouded booms in order to actually stop any spray actually going where you don't want it to go to. And we'll do that. Training, obviously critical. So operator certification, train your staff, do bring your staff up to speed. Certainly look at the Basis Amenity Training Register, because that is a process whereby you can actually upgrade yourself. Good practice, sprayer testing, please do that, because I can see that we're going to be hauled up if we're not careful as an industry, because we've not done as much as we should have done. Very good idea to do a chemical audit, because a lot of products are now gone out of date. You might have illegal products in your store. You need to speak to your distributor about checking those out. Record keeping, for heaven's sake, if you're thinking of any decision, just write a few notes down. Doesn't need to be anything fancy, just keep notes. And that actually is really going to protect yourself going forward. And the integrated management plan is really what you ought to be looking at doing. And thank you.
Peter, can I ask that you take any questions
Outside?
Of the foyer
Yep,
area,
we'll do.
or down on your stand?
Yep.
I think you're on B60.
Yes, yeah, I'm on the Rigby Taylor stand, so if anybody's got any questions, more than happy to take those. So thank you very much.